subject formation and the intending eye of a presumed and virtual subject formation operating the camera so that the doubled movement circumscribes and subsumes the space of the spectator, securing a camera eye which holds place for, simulates the presence of the eye of the spectator. In this manner, there is a presumed coextension, one might call it an identification, between the apparatus, the originary operator, and the present spectator, each and all of which serve as an evidentiary trace or an index of photographic verisimilitude, a technically reproducible access to the real. It is an instance of the camera's intercessionary penetration into human recognition, as happens when we look at a photograph of some person or watch an actor or character in a movie. As the filmic event unfolds before us, there are produced moments of sympathy or dislike, times when our hearts may race, our breathing becomes shallow, hair stands on end, and we become terrified or aroused or burst into laughter almost before we know it, as if the shadows before us have some privileged link to a present that has not passed away, but that which, once having taken place, arrested in the trace of an image, is present at every moment, persistently holding place for the potential recuperation of the real. Cinema has in this manner a promissory aspect, a strange prolepsis concerning technical reproducibility which is inscribed into its very social condition. A presumption that the repetition of the real constitutes a privileged access to the originary act or event, a strange and indeed modern spatial conceit that locates the deferred and absent trace into some sort of recoverable elsewhere. While the figures on the screen may be insubstantial phantoms, easily distinguishable from corporeal bodies, the experience of motion in cinema at a physiological level cannot be distinguished from an experience of real motion. As Christian Metz points out, there is a perceptual basis for the assertion that motion in the cinema is not a re-presentation, but a presentation, not the re-experience, but the very experience of motion, since the very same mechanisms that process real motion and apparent motion are brought into play in both cases. These same mechanisms for discerning the real enable our investment in this play of shadows, of pixels and lumens, and there's an uncanny commutability between one register, physiological, and the other, phantasmatic, such that real engagements and investments in the specular constitute the commonplace of our habitation. Well, it's the end of the third week, and that's pretty dense, and you guys are tired. Why don't I just tell you a couple of stories appropriate to this? We can have some questions then, and I will fulfill Wolfgang's request in this way. Wait a minute. You haven't heard the stories. One point. There's a very curious thing. Actually, can people hear me if I do this? Is it okay if I lean back? Yes. Sure. Okay, let's give an example of exactly this kind of intercessionary technology that's really quite curious. The early scientists who worked on the development of the scanning electron microscope had a very interesting task set before them. Most of them were European, most of the money that supported it was American. These things came together in a very curious way. What was that task? The task was, how do you make a picture of something which is so infinitesimally small that it exists and persists below the level of wavelengths of visible light? How does one make a picture of such a thing? You all know how a scanning electron microscope works, yes? Okay. Andrew, you would, of course. It's very simple. You have a stream of electrons, you draw it across the surface of an object, but you have to prepare the object, usually with a metallic vapor. The metallic vapor is usually deposited at some point that you can describe as a degree between 12 o'clock and perhaps, let's say, 2 o'clock. The deposition of a metallic vapor produces the equivalent of a positive form. Any place where there is an absence of that deposition, you have, for all intents and purposes, a shadow. As you draw a electron beam across that, the beam is reflected or absorbed, and you have a series of signals. The signals are put together on a raster, a television screen. Basically, you have an interference pattern, a picture emerges, you take a photograph of that picture, and that's what you have. There are a couple of elements about this process which are really quite interesting. In order to make this work, it's a very finicky, very difficult sort of machine, and the people who are developing this describe themselves as having to literally dwell within the machine, to inscribe themselves into a situation where they would have to tune themselves to a machine as they tune the machine to their own physical and bodily disposition, that word once again. So this goes on. At the same time, other curious things are inscribed into this very process, and it takes a while for this to happen. The pictures that are taken, and if you look in popular science magazines of the 40s and the 50s in particular, you'll see a lot of these pictures. Micrography always appears bearing a caption, something like, "The dry craters of this vast, strange lake, the huge bowls of this uncanny forest," and so on, whether they're talking about a flake of skin or a hair on somebody's arm, something like that. Everything is put into occlusion with one's own sensorium. There is inscribed into such pictoriality a horizon, an orientation, axes and points of location, deictic terminologies, a here, a there, a temporality, and all of this. But this is very curious. Why, at such an infinitesimally small level where the notion of horizon is truly senseless, literally doesn't exist, why do these pictures carry this meaning? Why are they oriented in this sort of way? It's very interesting. The nozzle, set at 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, as it deposits metallic vapor, reproduces essentially a kind of perspective, a kind of horizon. There's no reason for a horizon to exist there. One could put that nozzle anywhere, one could take that picture anywhere, one need not even append to it a kind of paratext, a title, a notation that secures it as an image of something, a landscape, for example. So what I'm trying to get is this kind of push and pull, this kind of dwelling within, inscription within, giving oneself over to a continuum of instrumentation moving from alterity to familiarity, and it is this aspect of familiarity, one aspect by which it is useful to understand what is meant by all the terms that are set in circulation around the notion of apparatus, dispositif, disposition, inclination, governmentality, frame, gestalt, etc., etc., etc. To begin to take some of those terms and to make them a bit more concrete, a bit more salient, but also at the same time to insist on something else, on their plurality and their permeability, and to also to inscribe into that the question of techniques, to insist on the kind of mediations which also operate in that space wherein, even if for a moment subjectivation and desubjectivation flicker and come into being. A few notes. The paper goes on, as you might imagine, considerably. There are conclusions and there are evidences, but I can see that the devil hovers behind me, and with that, I will thank you for your attention, bid you a good night, although I will entertain questions if indeed that is allowed, and we'll go from there.
You have been a great sleeping pill for Mike.
Yes. I will only take that from Mike as a form of flattery.
Right, you have the right voice, the voice of a fairy tale talker. But you brought in some reminder of the once towering figure of Foucault. You know, when Agamben was here, he said, you know, there's only two things Foucault did not talked about. It was law on one side, and what was the other? I forgot.
Yeah. Theology.
Theology, right.
Yeah.
That's the